One, who looked to be violently drunk, who was throwing up in the toilet in Chris's cell. Like the door of a fucking cage. He was an animal now. Chris grabbed at the bars and rattled them hard. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our book club series. So, I wanted to do something different today. I thought it would be comfortable to just chill in my actual room this time today and read in here instead of in the office every time. So I brought I'll just wait till you're gone. I get awkward when you're here.
Go ahead. I was trying to think of what.
I brought Mr. Sloth along with me today because we can't have a reading without Mr. Sloth here to supervise. Okay, we're starting on page 132. This is reading number 10, I believe. The bottom, just kidding, of page 133. It was felony day at the Grafton County Courthouse. In a state as rural as New Hampshire, serious crimes were committed fairly infrequently, so the felony arrangements were gathered into bunches every few weeks. More interesting than petty infractions, the proceedings were attended by local reporters, court groupies, and law students. Even so, the Harts were sitting in the front row, behind the defense table. They'd arrived at the courthouse shortly after 6 in the morning. Just in case, Gus had said. Gus's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that she did not know if she'd ever be able to untangle them. James sat beside her, staring at the judge. I gotta turn the TV off, it's distracting me. Okay. ADHD. Okay, anyways. Gus had said. Gus's hands were clenched. James sat beside her, staring at the judge. She was a grandmotherly, middle-aged woman with a bad perm. Surely, Gus thought, someone who looked like that would take one look at a child like Chris and would stop this debacle from going any further. This light is making me hot. But that's okay. We move forward. Gus leaned toward Jordan McAfee, who was arranging documents on his lap. "When is he going to be brought in?" she asked. "Any minute," Jordan said. James turned to the man beside him. "Is that the Times?" he asked. When the man offered the discarded paper, James grinned and thanked him. Gus stared. Oh, okay. James turned to the man beside him. "Is that the Times?" he asked. When the man offered the discarded paper, James grinned and thanked him. Gus stared at her husband, stunned. "You can read," she said, at a time like this? James meticulously creased the first section. He ran over the crease with his thumbnail and then did it again. "If I don't," he said evenly, "I will go crazy." He began to scan the front page. There were other women in here like her, Gus knew. Women who might not have been wearing a designer suit or diamond studs like hers, but who had a son who was going to be brought to a table like Chris was, accused of something too horrible to imagine. Some of those children had actually committed the crimes. In this, she supposed she was lucky. She could not imagine what it was like for those mothers whose sons had intentionally set fire to houses or stabbed enemies or raped young women. She could not fathom what it was like to know that you'd grown someone within your body capable of these atrocities. To know that if you hadn't given birth, this small measure of evil in the world might not have come to pass. At the sound of heels clicking down the aisle, Gus turned her head. Melanie and Michael Gold slid into the seats across from Gus. Melanie glanced at Gus blankly, and Gus felt her chest constrict. She had expected disdain. She had not realized that indifference could cut her more deeply. A bailiff opened a door at the right rear of the courtroom and led in Chris. His hands were cuffed in front of him, attached to a waist chain. He kept his eyes lowered. Jordan immediately rose and stepped up to the defense table, helping Chris into the chair beside him. The assistant attorney general was a young woman with short black hair and a nervous walk. Her voice irritated Gus. It was low and gravelly. It reminded her of the rasp a cinnamon stick made when you drew it over a grater. Judge Hawkins pushed her glasses up on the bridge of her nose. "What's next?" she asked. The clerk read, "The State of New Hampshire versus Christopher Hart. Grand Jury 5327 handed down an indictment on November 17th, 1997 on account of murder in the first degree. Christopher Hart is charged with willfully, knowingly, and deliberately shooting Emily Gold in the head and intentionally causing her death." The handcuffs rattled as Chris swayed. Hearing the words out loud and his name linked to them, he felt a horrible bubbling urge to laugh again, like he had at M's memorial service. He thought of Dr. Feinstein telling him how close together certain strong emotions were, and he wondered what might be the flip side of panic. There was a harsh laugh from the gallery, and for a moment Chris thought he'd actually done it. Let it fly loose past his clenched teeth. But when his head whipped around, like everyone else's, he saw Emily's mother, still snickering. The judge was staring at Chris. "Mr. Hart, how do you plead?" Chris looked at Jordan, who nodded. "Not guilty," he said, his voice thin. Behind him, Melanie Gold snorted. "Not guilty of what?" The judge narrowed her eyes at Melanie. "Ma'am," she said, "I must ask you to remain quiet." I'm not going to say anything. During the reprimand, Gus did not look at Melanie. Her head had bowed farther and farther toward her lap during the reading of the indictment. Murder in the first degree was the stuff of courtroom novels, of TV movies. It did not happen in real life. It did not happen in her life. Does the state wish to be heard on bail? The assistant attorney general stood. "Your Honor," Barry Delaney said, "given the severity of the charge, we request that the defendant be held without bail." Jordan McAfee was arguing before she even finished. "Your Honor, that's ludicrous. My client's a good student, a respected athlete. His family is well established in the community. He has few resources of his own. He poses no flight risk." "How come?" Melanie called. "He should go free. My daughter can't." The judge rapped her gavel. "Bailiff, escort this woman from the court." Gus listened to the click of Melanie's heels the entire way out. "Your Honor," said the prosecutor, as if the interruption had never occurred, "given the sentence accompanying a charge of murder in the first degree, there is certainly a flight risk." "Your Honor," Jordan retorted, "the prosecution is wrongly assuming there will be a conviction." All right. The judge pressed her hands to her temples and closed her eyes. "Counsel, save it for the trial. We're talking about murder in the first degree. The defendant will be held without bail." Gus drew in a breath but could not get enough air. She felt James's hand steal into her lap and grasp hers tightly. A bailiff walked toward Chris to lead him from the courtroom. "Wait," Chris said, looking back over his shoulder. He looked at his mother, at his lawyer. "Where am I going now?" Chris began shaking all over. The handcuffs were cutting into his wrists, and the waist chains sang with every step he took. He found himself back in the holding cell at the sheriff's office in the county court, a deputy locking the door behind him. "Excuse me," Chris said, summoning all his strength to call back the man who was already retreating. "Where do I go now?" "Back," the deputy said. "To court?" The man shook his head. "No, to jail." In a small cafeteria at the county courthouse, Gus rounded on Jordan McAfee. "You didn't even say anything," she hotly accused. "You didn't even try to keep him out of jail." Jordan held his hands out in front of him, placating. "That was a standard arrangement for a charge of that nature. There was very little I could do. A conviction of first-degree murder carries with it a sentence of life imprisonment. The AG figured that's enough reason for Chris to skip town, or for you to help him do that." He hesitated for a second. "It has nothing to do with Chris. It's just that judges don't grant bail to accused murderers." Gus, white-faced, fell silent. James sat forward, hands clasped. "There must be someone we can call," he said. "Strings we can pull. Surely this isn't fair, to be innocent but kept in jail until trial." "First of all," Jordan said, "it's the way the legal system works. Second of all, it's in Chris's best interests to have several months pending trial." "Months?" Gus whispered. "Yes, months," Jordan answered, unblinking. "I'm not about to motion for a faster trial. The time he waits to come up on the docket is the same amount of time I have to come up with a defense." "My son," Gus said, "is going to live for months with criminals. He'll be housed in general population at the jail, and I'm sure with his conduct, he'll be promoted to medium security. He's not mixed in with convicts serving out sentences, just with other people awaiting their own trials." "Oh," Gus spat. "You mean like the man who raped the 12-year-old, or the guy who shot the gas station owner during the robbery, or any of the other good citizens who were arraigned this morning." "Gus," Jordan said calmly, "any of those men could be just as wrongly accused as you believe your son to be." "Come off it," Gus said, standing up so abruptly she knocked over her chair. "Look at them. Just look at them compared to Chris." Jordan had defended his share of well-to-do clients, all shelled in a clean-cut persona and guilty as sin inside. He thought of the preppy murderer of the Menendez brothers, of John DuPont, all rich, all presentably charming, but he said, "The time will go by more quickly than you think." "For you," Gus said, "not for Chris. What's this going to do to him? If he wanted to kill himself a week ago..." We can move to have his psychiatrist visit him at Grafton," Jordan said. "And what's he supposed to do about school?" "We'll have something arranged." He looked at James, who watched his wife from a distance, stuck behind his own wall of terror. Jordan had seen that expression before. It was not so much disinterest as apprehension, stemming from the belief that any smidgen of emotion revealed would crack the careful mask of control and leave the person in pieces. "Excuse me," James said thickly, walking out of the cafeteria. Gus jackknifed, hugging her knees. "I've got to see him. I've got to get in to see him." "You can do that," Jordan said. "They have weekly visiting hours." He sat back inside. "Look, Gus," he said, "I'm going to jump through every possible hoop to figure out what I can do to get Chris out permanently. I want you to believe that." Gus nodded. Okay, Jordan said quietly. "Why don't I walk you out?" Gus shook her head stiffly. "I'm just going to stay here for a while," she said, rocking back and forth on the perch of her chair. "Well, all right," Jordan stood up. "I'll give you a call the second I have some information." Gus nodded absently, staring at the table. Her voice, when it came, was so soft that at first Jordan thought he'd imagined it. He turned anyway to find her staring at him. "Does Chris know?" She was asking, he realized, whether her son understood that he'd be in jail for several months. But Jordan heard the question at its simplest level. Does Chris know? And he thought, perhaps, Chris was the only one who did. The bailiff had escorted Melanie to a point several feet down the hall from the courtroom door. It did not bother her that she'd been kicked out of court after making a fool of herself. She had never intended to call out. The words just burst out of her like an odd, vengeful bout of Tourette's syndrome. The first time she'd spoken, she felt something give in her chest, like the spring of an old watch that had been wound too tight. The second time, a righteousness coursed through her that felt like the few dizzy moments after childbirth, when she had felt simultaneously exhausted and powerful enough to move mountains. It had not even hurt to see Chris sitting in the courtroom. Melanie had stared at the handcuffs on his wrists, at the red spots where they'd rubbed his raw skin. Good, she had thought. She leaned against the brick wall now, waiting for the arrangement to be over so that Michael could come out and tell her what had happened. Her eyes were closed and her head tipped back when the door to the courtroom swung open. A young man wearing a suede driving jacket approached her and stopped a few feet away. From inside his coat, he withdrew a pack of Camels and held it out to her. Melanie had not smoked since 1973. She reached for one. "Thanks," she said, smiling. "You looked like you needed a fix." A fix, she did, but in the more elemental sense of the word. "I saw you in there," the man said, holding his hand out. "I'm Lou Ballard." "Melanie Gold." "Gold," Lou said, whistling. "You must be the victim's mother." Melanie nodded, which explains why I was there. "I'm a stringer for the Grafton County Gazette." Melanie raised her eyebrows, inhaling deeply. "Court beat?" "None other," he laughed. "I'm sure you've seen my stuff buried on page 18 behind the weather map." Melanie crushed the cigarette beneath her heel. "Did the judge rule yet?" Bail was denied. Melanie exhaled. "Wow," she said softly. She felt as if she were floating an inch above the ground. "I think I need another cigarette," she said. Lou dug into his coat again. "How about an even trade? You get the cigarettes." He handed her the whole pack, and I get a front page story. Ooh, what's about to happen? I need somewhere to put, okay, it's fine. Chris changed back into a jumpsuit in the booking room of the jail. An officer led him to the pod where he'd spent the night. The TV was still on, and there were 2 new men in the area. One, who looked to be violently drunk, who was throwing up in the toilet in Chris's cell. Heedless of the sound and the smell, Chris crawled onto the mattress where he'd slept the night before. He stayed there for a few minutes, curled into himself. "I want to go home," he said. The drunk stared blearily at Chris. "I want to go home." He stood up, walking out of the cell toward the end of the pod where the officer stood behind a locked metal door. Like the door of a fucking cage. He was an animal now. Chris grabbed at the bars and rattled them hard. The officer stared at him. The other inmates ignored him. A few snickered. Chris rattled the bars again, and then more, until his hands hurt from clenching them. He fell to his knees and stayed that way for a long while. Then Chris stood up, dry-eyed. He walked past his cell toward the TV at the end of the catwalk. He sat down in a chair behind the black-eyed man with the goatee. No one spoke to him. No one even indicated they'd heard his tantrum. Sally Jesse Raphael was on. Chris let his eyes go wide, and he stared at the screen until he was seeing absolutely nothing. Okay, we're going back. Then April 1996. So, is this like a year ago? Because I think everything goes down in 1997, right? Whatever. It's April 1996. It says then. "Swimmers, take your marks." Emily leaned forward at the edge of her seat in the middle of the high school bleachers. She watched Chris snap the band of his goggles twice, for luck, and shake out the muscles of his arms and legs. Then he hooked his toes over the edge of the starting block. As he bent down, he turned his head and unerringly found Emily's face in a sea of others. He winked. There was a buzz. Then Chris bulleted into the water, streaking beneath the surface of the water to emerge halfway across the pool. His shoulders rose like a great whale, and his arms windmilled in a powerful butterfly stroke. He reached the 50-meter mark before any of the other swimmers. Then he turned, the soles of his feet flashing silver as he raced home. The gymnasium swelled with the yells of the crowd, and Emily found herself smiling. Chris reached the wall in an eruption of sound. Over the cheers, the student announcing the meet warbled Chris's time. A personal best, he crowed, and a new school record for the 100-meter butterfly. Panting, Chris hauled himself out of the pool. He was grinning from ear to ear. Emily stood up and pushed past the other people sitting on that row of the bleachers. Walking down the aisle, she made her way to the floor, where the next race was about to start. Chris hugged her and buried his face in her neck. Emily could feel the exertion of his heart and his lungs. She imagined the crowd watching as they embraced. The fact that everyone knew someone like him had picked someone like her was one of the things she loved about being Chris's girlfriend. Unfortunately, there were also things she hated. Carlos Crichton, who was nearly as legendary as... Oh my gosh. Who was nearly as legendary a breaststroker as Chris was a butterflyer, had the locker beside his. Nice race, Carlos said as Chris emerged from beneath a towel, his hair sticking up in spikes. Thanks, you too. Carlos shrugged. Of course, I could have probably gone faster if I had a hot little piece waiting for me at the finish line, too. Chris smiled tightly. It was no secret that he and Em were going out. They had been for almost 3 years, but that led to assumptions that were not necessarily true, like the fact that Emily put out, or why else would Chris have stuck around so long? The thing was, if he chose to set Carlos straight, it made Chris look like a fool. Bet you get some tonight, Carlos said. Chris shrugged into his shirt. Who knows, he said, just offhanded enough to sound modest. Well, when she gets sick of you, give her my phone number, Carlos said. Chris buttoned his fly, swung his knapsack over his shoulder. Don't hold your breath, he said. Emily knew that her relationship with Chris was very different from most of the other teenage relationships she saw at school. First, it was not a fleeting thing. She had known Chris her entire life. Secondly, it was truly love and not infatuation. Chris was practically a member of her family. That was why Emily could not understand what was the matter with her. When she and Chris had first started going out 2 whole years back, it had been an amazing exploration. There was no safer way to stumble through intimacy than with a good friend. But then something had changed. Chris's hands moved. Emily found herself fighting him off. At first it was fear, which gave way to curiosity. The problem was, curiosity gave way to something else. Hold on. Em did not know what sex was supposed to feel like, but she guessed it wasn't having your skin shrink back from his, your stomach roll, your head pound out that this was wrong. Every time her body betrayed her like that, she was embarrassed. It was clear that Chris loved her. Of course, he'd want to make love to her, and certainly it was right. For God's sake, she'd been hearing her name linked to Chris's since before she could speak. She could not imagine exposing herself so vulnerably to anyone but Chris. Unfortunately, she could not see exposing herself so vulnerably to Chris either. He'd yelled at her when she pulled away. Once he had even called her a cock tease. But Emily didn't mind, because the alternative was having Chris ask what was the matter. When that happened, she went silent, unwilling and unable to hurt him with the truth. With a vicious yank of the brush through her hair, Emily turned away from her bedroom mirror. Dinner had been a quiet affair, her father off on house calls, and her mother absorbed in the nightly news. She dropped her brush on her bed and gathered up her math books. Where do you think you're going on a school night? Her mother asked, as soon as Emily came into the kitchen wearing her coat. To Chris's, she said, to study. Oh, all right. Melanie poked at several buttons on the dishwasher. It hummed to life. Call when you're ready to come home. I don't want you walking through the woods when it's dark. Emily nodded and zipped up her jacket. It was still cool for April. She felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. Are you feeling okay? Yeah, I guess. She lifted her eyes, staring into her mother's, willing. Melanie to put together pieces that Emily could not fit into place by herself. If it was someone else, not Chris, would you let me go? Melanie smoothed her daughter's hair. Probably not, she said, smiling. But why talk about something that isn't going to happen? For a moment they both stood at the threshold to Chris's bedroom, afraid to enter. Chris swallowed. How come he'd never noticed how little furniture was in here? The dresser, the teeny desk, and that bed? Why don't we sit on the floor, he suggested. Relieved, Emily sank down and immediately began spreading out her notes. I think that McCarthy is going to try to get us on the proofs, so I thought we could go over some of the... She broke off as Chris leaned down and kissed her. We're supposed to be studying, she whispered. I know. I just had to do that. Emily's mouth twitched. You had to. Like you can't imagine, Chris said. He settled behind her, curved into the shape of her body, one big hand protectively slung over her ribs. This she liked, being close to Chris and being held, and well, just being. It was the other that upset her. She stared at a carefully printed page of graphs, wiggling because of what Chris was doing to her. She could feel his teeth scraping the tendons of her neck. Emily thought of the wavy sine curve on her homework. One half leaning in, one half pulling away. The floor that had seemed like a good idea. Monkish, but with Emily on her side, the slides and curves of her body were more apparent. It never failed to amaze Chris how one moment Em could be as familiar as his own sister, and the next a mystery. He kept thinking of what Carlos had said. Everyone on the planet probably thought he and Em were having sex. It was practically a given that they'd get married one day, so what was the big deal? It wasn't like that was the only reason he wanted to be with Emily. She certainly knew that. She let him kiss her. Sometimes she let him slide a hand under her shirt. He'd never tried anything below the waist. For that matter, neither had she. Chris curled closer behind her and began to kiss her neck. She twisted in his embrace. "We're not going to get any studying done, are we?" He shook his head. "I studied last night," he admitted. "Well, that's just great," Emily grumbled, turning to face him. "What am I supposed to do?" He was going to say study tomorrow, but the words came out wrong, and before he knew it, he had grasped Emily's wrist and pressed it between his legs. "You're supposed to touch me," he said. For a moment, her fingers curled around the length of him. Chris closed his eyes, drifting. Then her hand jumped, trembling. Emily jerked into a sitting position. "I can't," she whispered. Her face turned away. Stunned. Was she crying? Chris got up on his knees. "Em," he said softly, "I'm sorry." Afraid to touch her, he held out his arms. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and wet. It took a moment, and then she came to him. "I like this time of year best," Gus announced. She was sitting on Melanie's porch drinking lemonade, the unseasonably warm temperatures melting away the last of the winter's snow. "No black flies, no mosquitoes, no snow." "Mud," Melanie said, her eyes fixed on something beyond the tree line. "Lots of it." "I always rather liked mud," Gus said. "Do you remember how we used to let Em and Chris roll around in it like piglets?" Melanie laughed. "I remember scrubbing dirt out of the bathtub," she said. Both women stared down at the length of the driveway. "Those were the good old days," Melanie sighed. "Oh, I don't know. They still roll around, just not for the same reasons." Gus took a sip of her drink. "I caught them in Chris's room the other night." "Doing what?" "Well, they weren't actually doing anything." "And how do you know?" "I just do." Gus drew her brows together. "Do you think—" "Not with the same level of certitude that you do," Melanie said. "Well, if they do, so what? They are going to have sex one day anyway." "Yes," Melanie said slowly, "but it doesn't have to be at 15. So, everyone, my camera died, but I think we were right at 30 minutes. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you for following along with me and joining me on this book club series. I hope that you're enjoying it. I am definitely enjoying it. This book is super good. And yeah, anyways, just thanks for caring about this. Like, thanks for wanting to read this with me. Thanks for wanting to, I don't know. I love books and I love reading and I love stories and I love learning. So I just think stuff like this is so important to do together. So anyways, just thank you for caring about this and for joining me on this book club journey.
How y'all feel out there? I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.